Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Advertising. Now, what can anthropology have to say about the world of advertising? William Mazzarella, the scholar whose work Shoveling Smoke, which was an ethnographic study about the Indian advertising industry, would argue that it has a lot to say about advertising. So, the key question he poses is about what would Indianness conceived as an avatar of the global look like. And this is a topic of anthropological interest, because Indianness, a kind of a unique identity of the Indian, is as much cultural as it is about marketing. And advertising is another area in which a lot of anthropologists have not ventured into. It is more an area where marketing and management professionals and scholars have made more of a mark. And William Mazzarella is one of the few who has talked about it in great detail. But before we go directly into talking about his work, let's look at very briefly the history of advertising in India. Of course, some people would argue that from the time people started writing and drawing on walls and caves and elsewhere, that there has been advertising. Others would talk about the sort of great exhibitions and festivals about countries and continents that were held during the colonial times, also as a form of advertising. But in India, a kind of a professional ad agency came into being only in the early 20th century. And the kind of urgency that we see in discussions about Indianness start occurring more after economic liberalization. So, and slightly before that in the 1980s as well. So, from the 80s onwards is a very key period for us to look at as far as India is concerned. And one of the questions that occupied these agencies in dealing with marketing products from outside India for an Indian audience is how to be Swadeshi, how to be Indian, and how to be global, and how to do this at the same time. And this is a very tricky topic to walk through. And that Mazzarella does very confidently in his work. So, India is seen as this kind of sleeping tiger, sleeping elephant. These characterizations vary, but as this country which does not yet know of its potential, or a country which hasn't yet exhibited its potential, and therefore in need of more help in doing so. And if this has to be done, then there has to be some kind of reconciling which has to happen between the Indian as a nation state, identity as a nation state, and that of the global. So, for us to understand this, we will have to understand the change that has happened in the understanding of the middle class itself. So soon after independence, the middle class was characterized more as a vestige from the colonial times, people who preferred working in government occupations, public sector companies, big manufacturing companies, who were more concerned with kind of regular income and savings, a more austere lifestyle, and where connections with family and same group of people within the class background and kinship groups were appreciated a lot more. And education was not always in English medium schools. So education was also appreciated if it was in the vernacular. It wasn't seen as a huge drawback, and this characterized the middle class for a very long time, and some people would say up until the 1970s. That this is the kind of the middle class person that existed in India. The sort of secure, one who was not flashy, who did not aspire for much, just wanted a regular government job. Things start changing in the mid 1980s onwards, where a sense of we need to connect with what is going on in rest of the world. The world has kind of left us behind and we need to catch up. This sense of urgency starts acquiring more traction, particularly in the middle class. And one exemplification of this aspirational quality, which then comes to become a keyword, and as you will notice, aspiration is a word which is often used in the film industry, it's often used in the television industry, it is also often mentioned in the advertising industry. Aspiration is like the mantra for all of these industries, where also one should note that there is a lot of crossover of personnel between these industries. All these are labeled as creative industries, and therefore the quality of aspiration becomes very key. And this aspirational middle class is exemplified in the 1980s by the Maruti car. So the arrival of the Maruti car, advertisements about this car, car which was seen as something beyond the reach of the middle class, is now seen as possible. And in addition to this car, there are also lots of advertisements that come about the Bajaj scooter, the Hero Honda motorcycle, different brands of motorcycles then come for women. There are lots of cycles which are advertised for children. So those who lived through the 80s would remember advertisements being very popular in themselves, and sometimes advertisements is even more popular than some programs. In Purnima Mankekar's work, which I talked about in the previous lecture on television, she talks about a TV serial called Udaan, whose central protagonist was this actor Kavita Chaudhary, who was very popular at that time as the main person in an ad on Surf washing powder. So Kavita Chaudhary became known to the audience in India as the surf woman much before she became known as this serial actor in Udaan. And the same is the case with another actor, Priya Tendulkar, who also became well known as this sort of middle class questioning character in a TV serial called Rajini. So there are television serials which are made about the middle class, like Vagle Ki Duniya, which had this actor Anjan Srivastav playing this quintessential middle class person who is struggling to make ends meet while also trying to fulfill the aspirations his family has. So people want to buy more, want to wear good clothes, go out and eat, and yet there isn't a lot of money to go around. And how do you deal with these things? So Shah Rukh Khan made an appearance in one of the episodes of Vagle Ki Duniya, which was very popular at that time. Come 1991, and there is a lot of guesswork going on about the exact number of people which will fall under this rubric middle class. Some people said that they did not number more than 65 million, but there were calculations that the Indian middle class could be as big as 300 million, nearly equal to the population of United States. And then there were all these guesses that were being made about this middle class. Will they spend Will they be more concerned about savings? And all these multinational companies which came to India after 1991 were in the forefront of trying to do this guesswork about this middle class, because their business depended upon this middle class which would consume their products. And Mazzarella refers to the famous ad guru Alik Padamse talking about how these multinational companies did not really understand the middle class at all, and he even goes on to call them as MNCs, meaning misreading national culture. But this new middle class slowly began to be seen as predominantly present in the service sector, not so much in government jobs or public sector positions, but in occupations like software industry, hospitality, etc., where the income is very high, and they are also characterized by their interest in income much more than, say, loyalty to a particular firm or a place, and therefore prone to job switching and job hopping. So both metaphorically and literally very mobile people. So new cities start, new cities in the sense that cities which have existed suddenly become much more prominent. For example, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune. These cities become known to be places where this new young middle class would go. Predominantly English educated, drawn from English educated, predominantly urban based people, and also this middle class is seen to be not shy of displaying wealth. Unlike the older middle class who looked down upon any kind of show off, the new middle class prided itself in showing off. And also slightly ambivalent about the state, not entirely dependent on the state, and not also fully buying what the state would tell them. So there is a bit of an ambiguity in its relationship with the state. And so we have a lot of books about what is this Indian middle class. So India Unbound by Gurcharan Das is one, The Great Indian Middle Class by Pawan Verma is another, and then management gurus like Rama Bijapurkar also write books titled We Are Like That Only, Understanding the Logic of Consumer India. So there is a great desire to understand this category which seems to be beyond anybody's grasp, this middle class. So this middle class in Rama Bijapurkar's words is about both continuity and change. So it's about cobbling together, as she says, clever and low cost solutions that are ingenious combinations and adaptations of products available in the market. This understanding and desire to capture the imagination of the middle class is illustrated in the 90s by what is labeled as the Cola Wars, the kind of advertising campaign that was launched by both Pepsi and Coca-Cola to get into the minds of the Indian middle class. In material terms, this middle class is seen to be more engaged in consumption of goods, and this is physically demonstrated by the expansion of the mall. The mall, which was not so well known in India or present in India in the same way before the 90s. Before that we had what are called shopping complexes, but then we start having the malls late 1990s onwards, and in the millennium, of course, it just goes on and on and on afterwards. So why would advertising companies be so key then to understand culture? Mazzarella argues that it is in advertising, it is in the world of advertising that culture meets capital. And because at the end of the day, even if it is about money and marketing and numbers and sales, at the end of the day, what they are talking inside these advertising companies, as Mazzarella's work demonstrates, it's about culture. It's about creating this Indian consumer and building a relationship and negotiating identities of class, race, gender and ethnicity, but he also looks at advertisements as an arena where affect meets utility. So this is a prime locale for the anthropologist to be present, because what the advertisements do is also tap into people's individual and collective desires. So advertisements in those days also, and even now, are a lot about social relations. So we see a lot of advertisements about families, about relationship between grandparents and grandchildren and in-laws and siblings and friends. So relationships, families are very key. But his look at the negotiations that happen within advertisement companies and between advertisement companies and what happens inside through participant observation, what he tells us is that there is a lot of tension between creative personnel and the accounts people. People in charge of marketing and accounts have views which are very different from those whose only interest is in creativity, because marketing is seen as a science and creative people as lacking much knowledge of this science. So therefore there is a lot of tension which happens in there, and this tension, he says, is actually necessary and also enables the production of commodity images. He says that the production of commodity images depends on maintaining an ongoing and irresolvable tension between concretely situated affect-intensive materials, and there would be authoritative discursive elaboration in the form of brand narratives. So it is this tension which gives rise to the kinds of advertisements that are available. So we should take an advertisement itself as a commodity, he says, and a commodity, it is never really finished and released in the market and then forgotten about. It is constantly worked on. So there is constant reinterpretation and representation as he will call it, of an advertisement. So one example could be the Bajaj scooter advertisements, which taken over a period of 10 years can be seen to signify the kind of change that one saw in India at that particular period of time. So these advertisements which are which people recall more easily with the music and or with the particular tone, are then embedded in people's minds and therefore can be constantly reworked. This is a cultural product that you have access to. You recall it, it brings back a certain kind of memory in you, and then you change it and then you give it back and then see how that plays out. So Indian companies, he says, will have to deal with one big challenge, which is that they will have to play to the global market. So they will have to look world class and act world class and perform whatever is required to be recognized as globally arrived companies and brands, and at the same time they will have to appeal to the Indian consumer as well, and this creates another tension. So in his work he looks at how these executives deal with it, how Indian, how far can you go in becoming Indian, and how much Indian do you have to be, the global Indian, in order to appeal to this market versus that market. So there is a lot of study also about these markets and segregation into different areas, targeting people in different parts of India in a different way, something which will work in the southern part not working in the northern parts, and similarly some which would resonate with rural areas and not necessarily resonating with urban areas. And so this translations across cultures are often not very smooth processes. They are ridden with tension, and there is a lot of negotiation which goes on, and inspiration and aspiration are constantly talked about as much as about rationality. So clearly an advertising executive office discussion room would be an apt site for looking at these kind of discursive opinions from an anthropological point of view. Another scholars who are looked at advertising is Brian Moran, whose work on Japanese advertising is also very interesting for us to look at. He also refers to mozzarella and presents an argument about how advertising is a site of culture, and that advertising is a creative product. But he again refers to a point which we saw earlier in our discussions on cinema and television, as to whether advertising is about creativity, i.e. whether it's about art, or it is about profit. Is it business or art? So what is the most important thing with respect to advertising? So it is interesting to note that in all discussions of popular culture, this debate keeps recurring, the debate between art and commerce. So this debate is almost essential in order to situate something as popular culture, because this is the tension that popular culture has to deal with. But he also goes on to tell us about who are the stakeholders in advertising, and like Tejaswini Ganti and others who studied very intricately the industry from within, he also looks at who are the people who constitute an advertising agency. I mean, who are there and what are their jobs and profiles and what do they do. So again, there are multiple people involved here, and therefore multiple motivations. The copywriter would want to do things in a particular way, the stylist might have a different opinion, and one might say that this other person doesn't know what he or she is talking about. The photographer's perspective will be entirely different. He or she may be talking about camera angles and light, whereas these different stakeholders have different ideas. So the constraints and conventions that exist within the creative world play out in this advertising world as well. So he talks about how creativity, I mean, what is creativity? He defines it as something which is enabled as well as constrained by both aesthetic and economic material factors, none of which are different from each other. What he does is kind of lay out for us a sort of a diagram about who is located where inside the advertising agency to understand what is going on. So what happens when an advertising agency comes into Japan? Who are the people that are recruited and why are they recruited? And so he gives a lot of narratives, examples about why some person is seen as better placed by his boss because of his passion or the way of thinking, which is seen as not essentially so Japanese, but also the differences that an ad executive will notice. So for instance, it is believed that the Japanese will play more emphasis on the kind of clothes that a model would wear rather than the composition of the whole image. Because it is so focused on clothes rather than other things, other advertising executives see that the Japanese photographers are constrained, for example, in what they can or cannot do, and therefore since the focus is on something so material, their interest in or their ability to play with things creative become very limited. So this is just one example of the kinds of differences that Brian Moran shows us in his work on a Japanese advertising agency. In the third example, I will take what happens in America itself, but within a group within the United States which is not English speaking necessarily, and how racial and ethnic tensions are played out in the world of advertising. And here I am referring to anthropologist Arlene Davilla's work called Latinos Incorporated, Marketing and Making of People, published in 2001. And Arlene Davilla, who is an anthropologist at New York University, talks about how these advertisements are all focused on doing one thing. There is a lot of diversity within the group of people who call themselves Latino, meaning Spanish speaking people settled within United States. Now they can be from the Dominican Republic, they can be from Puerto Rico, they can be from Mexico, they can be from different parts of the Latino world. But in United States, they are all assumed to be pulled under one label called Hispanic. And she talks about how this lumping of so many diverse groups of people into one category creates a lot of problems, but also is very interesting to watch. I mean, how is this Hispanic person constructed from these very diverse groups? So what she did is interviewing people in lot of agencies, but she also looked at advertisements in 2 television channels, Latino television channels, to see how these identities are constructed and what kind of agendas drive this construction. What is the motivation here? So from the 1970s onwards, from the time people of Spanish descent are classified as Hispanic in America, there has been effort to look at this community and find out how to target them from the advertising perspective. So one thing she looks at, again like Brian Moran and William Mazzarella, is to look at the advertising industry structure itself and who is in charge of which department. And here what she finds is in the creative departments, there are more Spanish speaking people, whereas in the marketing department there are more Americanized Latinos who are put in charge. Because the idea seems to be that in order to think creatively, you should be more fluent in Spanish and much more Spanish speaking than other person. And one institution which is seen as defining the Hispanic person as opposed to the Anglo, as they refer to the Americans who are not Spanish speaking, is the family. So it is assumed that family is the institution through which advertisements will be targeted to this group of Latinos, Hispanics. So ads therefore came to be about a kind of a generic Hispanic person rather than paying attention to the differences within the Latino population. So skin color, for example, is a very important aspect here. So some Hispanics who are more dark complexioned are seen as not suitable to be models. So the models always have to be more fair skinned, or in fact in the words of one of our informants, a Latino model should have, a female Latino model should have long straight hair, coat and olive skin, unquote. So these models, this is what they believe a Hispanic person should and will look like, because it doesn't refer to any particular point of origin. It is just very generic. It refers to everybody who considers himself or herself Hispanic. And at the same time, so therefore this model is representative, and at the same time this model is aspirational. That is, they look Hispanic, but they look something more than most Hispanics look like, and therefore more aspirational. And this look she describes in her work as this look has seemed to have become more and more whiter. So the models are becoming more and more whiter, whereas the reality is very different amongst the Hispanic population. Another thing that is very important in the understanding of who is this typical Hispanic person and how do you select someone who will look like this person is also the accent. So the aim is to get someone who will speak Spanish without the influence of the American accent. So in order to target the group which is settled in United States, either for a short time or for a long time, the people who are featured in the advertisements are chosen on the basis of what level of influence the American accent has on their Spanish accent, and the less the better. So here the individual is seen as a consumer and the population is seen as a market, and this is how Davia argues a group is now created which is then ready for the advertisements that will be made by these agencies. In the last section here, what I want to discuss is not the work of anthropologists, but a very nice essay on this online portal called Tasveer Ghar, which is called The Story of a Soap. And I bring this into this lecture here because this will resonate very well with all of us who are familiar with the Lux advertisement. And Lux advertisements are seen now often on television, but even before the days of television, Lux advertisements were very popular and aspirational and had the aspirational quality for the audience. And before television, in the days of calendars, film stars will be featured on Lux advertisements in calendars, and it was considered something of a prestigious thing to be featured in a Lux calendar. So we have stars like Hema Malini, Nanda, Simi Garewal, Shashikala, who was seen as a villain, a female villain in Hindi films, also featured in Lux advertisements. Actors like Suraya were featured, Meena Kumari, and more recently Kareena Kapoor and Katrina Kaif, and so the one who is currently famous will always be featured on the Lux ad. So what is this Lux ad about, and why did it occupy such a pride of place in the film industry? And it worked to benefit both actors, that is the film stars who featured on the ad, brought in their fan following to the soap, and being featured on the soap itself added to the status of the film star. So it worked both ways. What did these Lux advertisements actually come to mean eventually? They were, as the author traces in the article, about modernity, because since the British period, Lux ads were featured in our calendars. So some of the first ads even featured this actor called Leela Chitnis, who most of us will know as this old frail woman who played mother to many actors, but in the 1940s she was a big star and she was featured on Lux ads as well. So Lux soap denoted modernity, middle class or upper classness. It also does refer to the skin complexion, you know, fairer skin without saying so explicitly. Lux was also about fashion. So it wasn't just about a bathing soap, it was also about fashion, which is why if we go through all the pictures featured on that online article, we can see that it reflects the styles of the times. So we see in the 1960s, for example, we see Hema Malini and Nanda with a very different hairstyle as opposed to Katrina Kaif, who lets her hair loose, as is considered fashionable now. And also faces going beyond boundaries. So a lot of these stars who were featured on Lux advertisements came from Bengali cinema, came from Tamil and Telugu cinema as well. So their faces crossed boundaries just like the Lux soap did. And in some ways it was also a documentation of Lux itself in India, the soap and how long it has been around, and the kinds of the woman that the Lux soap has targeted has changed with times as the actors have changed and their way of dressing and fashion has changed. And this also takes us into another discussion about gender in advertising, about which a thorough, in-depth anthropological research needs to be done. But there are a lot of articles out about how gender is a very important trope in advertisements and how they are mostly targeted towards women, and women are depicted in a particular manner. There are references to these old Coca-Cola ads or other soft drinks ads which feature women in ways that will not be appreciated very much now. So gender in advertising is another important topic, but the research that I have discussed in this lecture from Mazzarella, Moiran and Davia tell us a lot about the kinds of imaginaries that these companies have about what should be Indian and global, what is Desi and global, what is Latino, and what is Japanese way of defining self, which is different from the American way of defining self. So these are the kind of points in discussions about culture that advertising looks at. Thank you.